me your full name, where and when you were born?
I was born Elsie Duffel. I'm Ronald now. I was born at Southwick, and I lived at Southwick all during the war. For the first 30 years of my life I was at Southwick, and then when I married I came to Roker.
Can you tell me a little bit about your parents? What did your father do?
I came from a whole generation of miners, but my dad was working at the colliery and training to be a deputy when his lung collapsed, so I had to leave, and we were on the dole until the men were called up, and then he got a job as a tram conductor and later on a tram driver.
Did your father serve in the First World War?
No, he would only be a child.
Did you have brothers and sisters, and whereabouts in the pecking order did you come?
I was the second oldest of 3 girls, and I had a sister born in 1940, in the middle of the war, and a brother in 1946, just after the war.
Did you have a happy childhood, and what was it like growing up in Southwick?
It was a pleasant place. You didn't need to leave your door, lock your doors. Everybody looked out for each other. Everybody swept their front street and cleaned their steps with donkey stone. This is pre-war, of course. Things changed when the war started, and we could play out in the street. There wasn't cars and anything like that. There was hardly any cars in a place like Southwick. But there were some very nice houses in Southwick. I grew up in a cottage. But they were always kept perfectly. They were called little palaces. The women were house proud.
Can you remember the build-up and the outbreak of war?
Not really. I can remember my parents making the blackouts for the windows. I think that must be the earliest time I was aware of the war, because I was only 6 and 2 months. And I don't really know when my sister was evacuated and why I wasn't. I think it might have been because I was in hospital having my adenoids out, and when I came out of hospital she might have disappeared. I remember lying on my back on the bed and banging my heels against the wall, crying, "I want Jean, I want Jean," because we'd never been separated and I wanted her to play with. And I was told she was evacuated and I wanted to go to be evacuated.
Did you ever worry through the war what might happen?
Oh yes, I had nightmares, and 77 years later I can remember them. I had a vision of my mum and dad walking away from our street, and it had all been bombed, and they just had a little suitcase, and we were away, either evacuated or staying with grandparents, and we didn't know where they were. But as for during the air raids, I suppose our parents were worried all the time if there would still be a house when we came out of the shelter. But I don't think we worried so much about that at such a young age.
What were the day-to-day living conditions like? What was a typical day like?
Well, there was blackout. We didn't very much go out to play. There was white paint put around the lampposts and on the curbs so that to try to stop people falling over or walking into walls and things. There was an awful lot of queuing. Everything rationed. Meat especially seemed to be scarce, and of course fruit. We'd never seen an orange or a banana. But I still remember going to Thompson Park to play, whether it was later in the war or not, because it was quite a long walk, and I don't think my parents would have wanted us so far away. We had to change our Sunday school because it was further away, we went to one at the bottom of Stony Lane. It was a queer round building. I can only remember it once, very vaguely. But when the war started, we came to a nearer church. Dad was a Methodist and Mum was a Church of England. So we went to the Methodist, which was slightly nearer.
What was it like being in the areas?
It was frightening. It was terrible being woken up from a deep sleep and having to go into the shelter. And of course the shelter wasn't all that warm or comfortable or anything. We had bunks in it, of course, and blankets and things. And we heard the bombs dropping, and if there'd been damage round about, the smell of the plaster and things. I remember one time we were in the shelter and there was a rat-tat-tat going, and I thought it was somebody who'd been bombed out wanting to come into our shelter, and they were rattling the sneck on our back door to get our attention to come in. And it was actually guns. Apparently they had guns on trailers that they brought around the street, and it was the bullets going up. But I was saying, go and let them in, go and let them in.
What was the food like? And when rationing kicked in, did you notice much of a difference?
Oh yes, well, you might get one slice of corned beef or something. Why now you would have a roast and things like that. It was very difficult then. And I think it was hard for parents, but of course I didn't appreciate that at the time. But my mother was a good cook and she could skin rabbits and clean herrings and crabs and things like that. I can't really remember being hungry, but maybe my parents were, I don't know.
Can you remember any funny incidents happening?
Not necessarily funny, frightening ones. My sister, who was 2.5 years older, she was more of a tomboy than me, and she got me into all kinds of trouble. And there'd been a big raid in the next street to our school, and instead of going straight home from school, we went round to the next street to see the bomb damage. And there were wardens picking up the debris, and I was sure when they picked that great big piece of wood up, there would be a dead body underneath, and I was absolutely terrified. There was one time we were up for a walk in North Hilton Road, and there was an aeroplane standing in the field, and of course we went over to get to it, but we were chased away. There was a guard on it. I think it must have been coming back to Usworth, and it hadn't quite made it. And in those fields, of course, there was great big ditches dug, or concrete posts cemented in so that aircraft couldn't land in them. They must have greatly feared invasion at that time.
Can you remember anything tragic happening around your family or your community?
Well, we always went out to see the bomb damage, but we didn't actually... We knew people whose houses had been damaged, but not anybody that had been killed. One of my cousins, who I never knew, died in an air crash over Scotland. He was he'd been a Spitfire pilot during the war, and he died just after the war, after it had crashed, but before the J Day. I do remember hearing about this special bomb that had been invented, and that obviously was the atomic bomb, and that was the end of the war. And after the war, I remember seeing men back from the war with half a leg missing, and it was just like a wooden stump. And when we were at Sunday school, there was a man who used to come in. He must have been shell-shocked, and he just used to stand at the back and shout. Must have been post-traumatic stress.
Yeah. been frightening as a child to witness the aftermath.
Yes, and of course a lot of the soldiers couldn't get jobs and they were just scrapping about for things. There was one man who'd been in the Air Force, was making little rocking horses. He took an empty shop at the top of our street.
How did you cope generally day to day with fear? Was it something that you thought about a lot, or was it just when there was an incident?
I remember if we were out for a walk and we saw a man coming towards us, we'd think, he might be a German, let's cross over. But of course, 6-year-olds have an imagination, don't they? I do remember just after the war, a slightly funny incident. Our 12-year-old, and I must have been very naive. There was a German submarine that had been captured, and it was on shore in the South Dock. And we were taken down from school to walk through it. And all the way walking through this kind of galley, I was thinking, there'll be a German in those cupboards and he'll jump out on me. 12-year-old, I mean, I should have been past that. A modern day 12-year-old would have been.
Where were you when the war ended, and what can you remember about it?
Just hearing about the special bomb. I can't really remember VE Day. We used to listen to the news. My dad used to say, now come on, sit down and be quiet and listen to the news. But of course, as a child, it didn't mean a lot. My Nana, who lived next door, didn't have a radio and would be sent to tell her, like, Belgium's been invaded. Well, it was just words. And sometimes she came in to listen to our radio. And I remember one time she disagreed with something the newsreader had said. And she said, if I tell him what's wrong, can he hear me?
What were the changes at school during the war?
The schools closed immediately. I was in the infants. I must have just been in the first year of the infants, and they closed. Some of the junior schools went to houses, but just for odd half days. And then, after a few months, I went to join my sister who was evacuated, and the village school, having all these extra children, there were 2 classes in one room, one facing the front and one facing the back. And I think the local children resented us a little bit. I don't think we're friendly. I wasn't evacuated long. There was a phony war. The raids hadn't started, but they started after we got back, and 40, 41 and 42 were pretty horrendous with their raids.
Do you often think back to the war?
I have very much lately, because I thought I'd better write things down. I've written my life story because I thought, well, it's a shame for nieces and nephews who have no experience of these kind of things. So I've been thinking about it quite a lot. And I am very interested in local history, and I've got thousands of books. So I do think about it.
Did you want to show us some of the stuff you'd brought through?
There was an air raid shelter under the green at Southwick, and when we were going to school, my sister and I sometimes walked through. It must have been for a day. It was frightening, but that's in Mowbray Park, but it must have been something like that. We walked in at one end and through the shelter and out at the other end, but it was dark and quiet and frightening. The beaches were closed. There was rolls of barbed wire along to stop invasions. So I don't know how. I think I've seen that picture. That's the fishermen cottages along Whitburn, but I'm sure I've seen the roofs like that. But I don't know quite why, how, when the beaches were closed. But I remember after the war, Marston Beach was open, and the whole family of us walked to Marston from Southwick, and my brother was in the pram and my sister was sitting on the pram, and the rest of us, including me, Nana, who would be in her 70s, all walked to Marston to go on the beach. I live 5 minutes from it now and I don't go. But we were used to walking in those days.
Must have been a novelty to have the freedom back.
It must have been. I should have taken more notice at the time, but...
And is there anything else you remember from the time that you'd like to let us know about?
What was fun when we were evacuated, my sister had been there for a while, well, for maybe a month or so before I went. I remember walking down from Southwick with my mum and dad, and it must have been very early in the morning because the first trams were coming out of the tram depot at the Wee Chief, and they were all blacked out. There was blue paint on the windows and the lamps were shaded. So this must have only been between 5 and 6 in the morning. I went to Monqueermouth station and I got on the train. There was a lady taking me. She was going to visit a son in the same village, Thirsk. And I'd been bought a comic as a treat. And I looked at it for a bit and then I put it down. I wanted to look out the window. And she said, "Shall I put that in my bag?" And I never saw that comic again. And I feel as if she stole it after 77 years. I mean, I don't think I'd finished it, and certainly my sister hadn't seen it. So why did she take it? And that annoys me to this day. But it was interesting because it was the man was a blacksmith, and we saw the horses coming to get their shoes put on. I love seeing blacksmiths even to this day. And last year I went down and found the house again. It's changed a bit since then, but it was nice to see it again.
And you mentioned that you'd gone down to the Imperial War Museum.
Oh yes.
What was it like experiencing that so many years later?
It was more frightening than the actual raid, actually. It was a brick shelter, the same as we'd had in our backyard. And we sat in along benches at the side. We heard the bombs dropping. And even though we knew it was just a mock-up, we were sitting like this, as if it was real. And when we came out, we smelt the plaster and everything. Of course, we didn't see houses demolished round about us like we had in the war, but it was frightening. I suppose being older, it had more impact. That was about 1992 or 3. It was some commemoration. Might have been might have been the D-Day or something like that.
Yeah.
Have you interviewed any soldiers?
Not yet.
Because I've got a sister in Hampshire, but her father-in-law lives over at Grindon. He's 101.
Wow.
And he was on the D-Day beaches. Bright as a button he is, and he's just got a medal from France.
Wow.
He could probably tell you some interesting stories.
Yes, yeah.
I'll see if I can get his phone number and I'll email it to you.
Yeah.
Have you seen the veterans walk in Mowbray Park?
Yes.
It's great, isn't it?
It is. It's lovely. It's nice to see new commemorations
Yes.
starting.
People seem to be taking more notice of it now.
They do, yeah. I think there's an appreciation of what your generation went through and what you did for everyone else.
Well, I wasn't in the army or anything. I have a friend who was in the Air Force, and she used to go out to planes that had crashed and see injured pilots or maybe even dead crew on the aeroplanes, but she doesn't talk about it. And I had another friend who didn't want to kill anybody, so he volunteered as a scientist, and he volunteered as a bomb disposal. And he was the most decorated man in the world. George Cross, George Medal and Bar. So he had interesting stories to tell, but you can't interview him because he's gone.
Yeah. And what's your life been like after the war?
I've had a good life. If I die tomorrow, I cannot grumble. I am 83. I worked. I left school one Friday and started working in an office on the Monday, where children cannot expect that nowadays. And I enjoyed my job and I worked hard and had a good marriage. I've been a widow for 26 years, but I'm still doing my bit.